Welcome back, friends. Alright, so in this video we're going to continue the project by writing some C#. So what I want you to do to complete this stage of the process is double click on the submit button. And it should bring up the file that will run behind the scenes written in C#. Alright, so you should see this. Button submit _ click. And let's add some code now. So we're going to do basic database connection code. First of all, that page load, you can get rid of that. That's not too important for our purposes. And take a look here. Go into web.config for a second. And you see this where it says configuration and all of that? We don't have a connection saved yet. Well, that means we've got to make a connection string. Take a look. So go back into default.aspx and then make sure you select the SQL data source and a little arrow to its right, and then configure the data source. And configure here simply means connect to the database table, that's all. Okay, so click new connection. All right, find your server. Good. SQL Express, select the database. Remember that in the context of these lessons, we're using my DBase. That's where we made our table, if you think back to it. Test the connection. Test connection succeeded, good. And then just click OK. Click next. All right, you may want to rename the connection. So for example, I will say, now it says my DBase connection strings. I will say, for example, person table connection string or something like that. Click next. Give it a second to take here. And it says you're saving the connection string. And now here, make sure you select the table that you want. Our table would be this one over here. Let's find out, you have to be careful. So person table. And select ID, name, email, data added. Select all the fields. All right, and then click on advanced on top of it. And make sure over here you've got to generate, insert, update, and delete statements. And remember, look at the message. It says you must have all primary key fields selected for this option to be enabled. Okay, keep that in mind. And then just click OK. And then click next. Test the query. There we are. I just added John and his information a few times. Click finish. So you have the connection saved. Let's go back into the web.config file and take a look at what is inside. We've got this new element called connection strings, and it says add and then name. So you've got its name, and then you've got the actual connection string itself. And the provider name, of course, is just SQL client, that's all. So we can access this quantity here. We can read it from web.config, okay? Take a look at what I mean here. Let me close web.config at this point. I wanted to show you to this so you understand the next steps where stuff is coming from. It's stored here, and connection strings in that setting. Let me close web.config. And now, go back into default.aspx.cs, and understanding that we have the connection saved in web.config, we can type the following. Right above protected void button submit, I will type this. String, const string, equals, and then I will say configuration manager. And when I start typing and I see that it doesn't show up and IntelliSense is not giving me any suggestions, that usually means I need to add additional namespaces. So up here in that block, I will type this. I will type using and then system that configuration, like that. And notice as soon as I add this, down below that turns into like a light green color, okay? So configuration and then type manager and then dot. So what is a configuration manager? Let's take a look. It says provides access to configuration files for client applications. That's it. And then I'm going to say dot, and then I will say here connection strings. What is connection strings? Well, it says gets the connection string section data for the current application's default configuration. So select that, and then between square brackets, take a look. Choose this one. It says gets or sets the connection string settings object with a specified name. So in our case, remember, we had a connection string that we created, and now we can type it here as a string, which means between double quotes. And that's coming from the web.config file, if you forget it, okay? So let me go back there for a second, and maybe the best thing to do is to just copy it. So just take it from here, person table connection string, right click, copy it, and paste it into the correct spot over here, like that. And then that's not enough. That doesn't work by itself. You're getting an error message. You see this? So right now we have a configuration settings. We need to now get the actual connection string. So to do that, I will type dot, and then I choose the connection string property. Okay, like that. And then terminate all of this with a semicolon here. So this first line that I've just created is a string. And I know that because on the left side I have a string, and on the right side of a mouse of in connection string, and it's a string also. The data types are matched. That's a big theme in C#. Keep that in mind. Matching data types between the two sides of the assignment operator, the equals sign, that is. And now that we have that available, we can build up the rest of our code. Take a look. So I'm going to go as follows. I'm going to say this. You're going to make a new SQL connection. And again, that's not available. We got to add additional namespaces. So up here, I will say the following: using data. I'm just going to add all of them all in one go, just to have them. So using system.data, and then the next one here, using system.data.sql client, like that. And we've got the configuration. And let's also add this one, using system.sql, data.sql, rather. Okay, and notice as I type, some of these will turn black, and that indicates they've come into use. All right, so I'm going to type SQL connection first. I'm going to type SQL connection, like that. And notice SQL client has turned black. It's come into use. All right, next stage, I'm going to say this. I'm going to give it the name con. I'm going to equal that to a new SQL connection, like that. And I'm going to say con string. Remember, we've learned about this before, how to initialize a connection, right? You pass in a connection string, that's all, like that. And because I have the connection string declared above this block of code, this object here is accessible throughout my code. If you place it inside this block, every time you click submit, right, you're going through the whole process of getting the connection string again and everything else. So I place it outside here, and that's it. All right, good. Next stage here, take a look. So we make the connection object, and then I'm going to say SQL command at the next stage. And I'm going to give it the name COMM. I'm going to equal that as follows to a new SQL command, like that. And now remember, we made a stored procedure which we called proc insert. I'm going to put that here, and I'm going to type proc and then insert. And then that also needs the connection object, so type CONN. So in this case, remember, when you make the command object, you can input a specific query text, or you can input the name of a stored procedure, like proc insert, and then the name of the connection object. At the next stage, I'm going to say this. I'm going to type COMM and then dot command type. And what is the type of command? It's a stored procedure. So I'm going to type command type dot stored procedure. And if you have a mouse over a command type, it says it's an enumeration. If you right click on it and you go to the definition of it, right click and go to definition, F12, it tells you what it is. You see that? So text is 1, stored procedure is 4, and then table direct is 512. All right, we'll expand that, and then that. So table direct, name of a table. Obviously, this is a whole separate discussion here, right? But the point is that we have an enumeration, and text corresponds to 1, stored procedure also corresponds to 4, and table direct corresponds to 512. That's what enumerations are, lists of named constants. 1 is named as text, and 4 is named as stored procedure. Named constants. Okay, let me close that. Next stage here, I'm going to type this. I will say command, and then I will type this, parameters, and then dot, and then add with value. I'm adding parameters to my command object. And where am I going to get these parameters? Well, think about the ones that we have when you made the table, correct? And we had the insert. We made a list of fields, and then we had a list of parameters also to go with the stored procedure. Remember, the header of the procedure had a list of parameters. I'm putting those here. So I will say as follows. Between double quotes, I will say name, and then a comma. And because I'm using add with value, you write the name of the parameter with the @ symbol, and then object value. That means you got to read the value to be passed into the table from somewhere. In our case, I'm going to type txt name and then dot text. So what this is saying, the single line is this. You're taking the command object, you're adding parameters, you're adding them with value to be more exact. So you're specifying the name of the parameter, comma, and then the object where the value is to be read first, so it can be passed into the table through the parameter. That's coming from the text property of the text box that we named txt name. Okay, it's coming from there. Then you repeat this for the other controls. I hope you've got that. So Control C and then Control V down below naturally enough. And let's see, let me put that, and then I'm going to change this so it says here email. And again, this one will be coming from txt email from the text property. So you write, remember, the name of the control, dot, and the name of the property like text. So you can read it and then send it to the database table. And let's do this one more time. Control V down below. And lastly, between the double quotes, now I will say date added. And then that's going to come from the following. Take a look. Remember, we have an object called calendar. I'm going to type calendar1. We added it. So calendar1 and then dot selected date. Hover your mouse over selected date, and what is it? You see this? It says it's a date time. Okay? So set gets or sets to selected date. That's it. Remember back to our table design, we have a column named, I believe, date added, and then the data type was date. So this should work. All right, let's take a look. Continue here. So we've got our command parameters with their values set. At the next stage, we try to make everything work. Take a look at what I mean. So I'm going to do a try and a catch. And I'm going to do a try and a catch because whenever you're dealing with internet connections and so on, things can disappear, connections can drop, and so on. So within the try, I'm going to do this. I'm going to type con and then dot open. So if you look at it, it says opens a database connection with this property setting specified by the connection string. Okay, so try to open the database connection. Assuming that has worked well, you're going to execute the command object essentially. You're going to execute the command. So to do that, I will type COMM and then dot and then execute non-query. So if you look at the tip that shows, it says executes a transact SQL statement against the connection and returns the number of rows affected. There you go. Transact SQL, remember, is Microsoft's version of SQL. That's what they call it. So execute non-query. Remember, we are basically reading values from the boxes and then passing them into the table so you can update records. All right. That looks like this. And let's see here. Hover your mouse over open for a second. So one more time, hover your mouse over open for a second and look at the exceptions. Invalid operation exception, SQL exception, configuration error exception. Because this method, this function named open, can generate problems, you put it in a try. So if the problems are generated, they can be caught. Right? Take a look at execute non-query, exceptions. Again, exceptions, you see? So if one of those occurs, you want to be sure that it's handled well. That's why I've got those two methods here within the try. I hope that's clear why they're there. Next stage, I will say catch. And then I'm going to type exception and then EX. So exception is a class, and it says represents errors that occur during application execution. That's all. So just as you can have, again, a connection object, and you can have a command object, you can also have an exception object. That's what this is saying. You have an exception object. The name of the exception object is EX. Just like, remember, the command object can have properties like command type. The EX object, the exception object, has its own set of properties that you can read to get useful messages to the user. Take a look. So within the catch, I'm going to type LBL. And remember, we had one named error. And then I'm going to say .txt. So now we're going to set the text property of the label named label error. And I'm going to type ex.message. That's it. And I can do that because if you hover your mouse over message, you see the data type is string. It's just some text. So if something happens with these methods here when I execute, then I'm going to display that to the user in the label error message. That's all. So at least the person knows what's going on, you see? And at the end of all of this, whenever you're dealing with connections, remember in the previous videos I told you about using the using statement to get a connection, use it, and then dispose of it properly. I'm going to show you now. You can also type this. You can type finally. And again, between a set of curly braces, type con and then .close. You want to make sure the connection is fully closed at the end of it. Okay. And again, if you want to know more about these things, what do? Well, you right-click on SQL connection, go to its definition for a second. And it looks like this. See that? And if you look at it, it tells you what's inside here. Obviously, this is not a class dedicated strictly to C#, so I can't go over all of the detail, but I want you to be aware of the fact that it is here. Okay? So you've got what are known as constructors. These are the bits that run when you make the object. Notice this is SQL connection, the same as the name of the class, SQL connection. And you see where it says colon and then DB connection and then comma I clonable. Again, just right-click on DB connection for a second and go to its definition. And notice that DB connection implements an interface. Okay, I talk about interfaces in such details in my other class on object-oriented programming. The big idea though is take a look, it says iDisposable. You see that? So right-click on iDisposable, go to this definition, and it defines a method named dispose. Expand.node, and it says performs application-defined tasks associated with freeing, releasing, or resetting unmanaged resources. That means when you're writing to the drive or reading from the drive, you got to be sure everything gets closed properly, or you will end up with holes and leaks. So let me close this. Okay, that's enough of an aside on that topic. And at the next stage here, take a look. You want to make sure that after you've inserted new information into the table, that the grid view gets updated after the process completes. So at the bottom, type the following. Type grid view 1 and then .data bind. That will ensure that the grid view is refreshed with the new data from the table you've just updated. There you go. Binds the data source to the grid view control. That's it. All right, so all of this is configured now. Let me close web.config. This is the C# from top to bottom here, just like that. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I want to be sure I see a little more of it. There you go. And remember that I put this up here, the connection string, outside btn submit. So for example, if I want to use the connection string and another event handler, right, another block of code like this, I could, because it's outside this one. It's defined outside it, so it's accessible throughout my code. All right, I'm going to give this a go. So hit Google Chrome for now, and we have this here. So let's enter some values first. Okay, I'm going to enter a name like, say, Tom. Enter email, so tom@gmail.com, and then enter some date. Now, I can enter the date by hand, but if I click on a calendar, I should also be able to insert that date into the enter date box. I want to do that also, just to show you that it's possible. So I'm going to shut this down for a second and go back to default.aspx. And now, double click on the calendar, and it brings up something called calendar1 underscore selection changed. So when you interact with the calendar and you change the selection, meaning you click on a different day, you want to save that, for example, into that little text box right above it. So to do that, I will type txt date dot text equals, and then I will type the name of the object, calendar1, and then dot select the date. That's a property that it possesses, naturally enough. You should be able to get that after all, select the date. And then dot, and then lastly, toShort date string. It says converts the value of the current datetime object to its equivalent short date string representation. So I'll take a look at that in a second. Short date string means stuff like this. Make sure you close with a semicolon, put 2 slashes for a comment. In other words, you want them to appear like this as an example. You see, 10/24/2017, and not like October, comma 24th, comma 2017. Short date string, that's what it does. All right. And now go back to default.aspx. And the last bit is you've got to take the grid view and you've got to configure its data source. So click the little arrow and then choose the data source and then choose SQL data source 1. That's good. And notice it gets filled here with ID, name, email, and data added. That's good. We want to see that. And then enable paging, sure, sorting, editing, deleting, selection, enable everything. Why not? Okay. And with all of this configured in this state, this is the interface. You may want to pause at this point, look at it carefully. Okay, and then now this is all of the code. Again, I'm going to try to fit everything on the page here as best as I can. Oh, that's too big. Let me put in 40% instead. Let's see. So that looks like this from top to bottom, the code I've added. Okay, and make sure at the top, in terms of namespaces, you have the ones that I have in this block. To remove some of them, right-click, remove and sort usings, and get rid of the ones you're not using. That's it. So you should really have only 4 now that you look at it. And now let's just give all of this a go. So hit Google Chrome. Let it load here. Okay. And, well, first of all, I need to zoom out. This is a little too big. And it looks like this. Good. Now take a look. The grid view is working, and I know that because I see I've got information already populating the rows. Okay. I just added the same field multiple times. Not important for our purposes. If I select 26, as soon as I do that, you see it fills the enter date field. If I select 27, it fills it with the new value. Enter 28, fills it with the new value, okay? Now, let's put in some name. So I'm going to say here, for example, Tom. I'm going to enter an email. Like that. Imagine I entered the date. I'm going to click submit. And now, on the bottom, take a look. It says could not find stored procedure proc insert. Well, that's useful because that's telling us a useful message that an error has occurred. So take a look. How do we fix this? It's very likely that because there's so much code, I misremembered something, but we can fix it easily. Take a look. Go to SSMS over here, and then remember where I'm using my DBase, and then go into programmability, that folder, expand store procedures, and it's called insert proc rather than proc insert, you see? So that's an easy fix. Take a look. Go back into Visual Studio and change proc insert into insert proc. But that was a good test, right? Because at least we learned that everything is working in terms of generating a useful error message. All right, so now let's give it another go. We've made the change, so hit Google Chrome. All right, now let's take a look. So I'll try it again. I'm going to say Tom, enter email, so Tom at blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter what we put there, as long as it's got the format of an email. Enter the date, select something from the calendar, and then hit submit. And another information, as you can see, is that says expects parameter at date saved, which was not supplied. Useful information. Close it. And what is that telling us? Well, we go back to here. and then expand dbo.insertproc, expand that in SSMS, expand the parameters, and it says date saved. Like that right here. You see that? So over here, go back to Visual Studio and change this so it says date saved rather than date added. I was thinking about trimming away what appeared to be mistakes, but then I thought to myself, if you see these, they'll be useful to you because they confirm that the try and the catch and so on are actually working and generating useful messages, and then you can see how to fix them relatively easily. All right, so now head to Google Chrome, give this another load here. All right, so let's try it again. Tom, enter email, enter the date from here, and then hit submit. And it's working, and I know that it's working because as soon as I click submit, look at the grid view down below, it added this record, you see? Okay, not that one. I mean just the bottom one right here, right? It's been added. The ID, remember, is automatically generated because we had identity 1,1 applied. And the name, the email, and the date added have all been stuck in automatically. So that confirms that everything is working, okay? Let's see, I'm going to click on the right to the right a little bit. Like that. And I want to do one more thing. Let's take a look here. Click edit for a second on the grid view. Okay. And then imagine I enter some, I don't know, John Smith, and I hit update like this. And that's still good. So let's reload the page for a second. Hit enter. So hit the little arrows to reload the page. And then you're going to get one of these messages. You see that? That's okay. Just click continue. And everything is still good. Okay, so now that we have all of this, I'm going to shut this down for a second. And I'm going to run this one more time to show you the problem that we have to fix. It's something that's not obvious, but take a look. Imagine I don't enter any values and enter name, enter email, enter date. And I click edit down below. And I just remove the Smith and I click update. And then I do that. You see how up here this gets immediately shown? So the grid view is causing the page fields to get validation applied. And that's why this is showing. We need to disable validation caused by the grid view. So I'm going to close this and go back to default.aspx. So to fix the problem with the fact that validation is caused by the grid view, this is what you can do. Take a look. Click on this grid view tasks and then go to edit columns. And you see where it says selected fields on the bottom in that panel, like command field properties, for example. If you go through them, you see that one of them says causes validation. Just change that to false so they don't cause validation, and then click OK. All right, now we have made that fix. So hit Google Chrome, reload the page. I want to confirm everything is working. Let's observe here. All right, so again, remember before, if I try to update, then this would cause validation on the boxes to be applied. So this time I'm just going to hit edit on John Smith over here, right? Like that, and then just hit update. And notice the validation is not being applied to the boxes anymore. And that's good. We want that. Okay, let me close this. I know this video is quite long, but as you can see, just to make a page that has practical, realistic features takes a considerable amount of coding, thinking of how the pieces should be synchronized together the right way. So I'm going to leave this here for a second. This is the interface. This is the code from top to bottom. This is the set of usings at the top of the page. Okay. This here will be web.config. This is my configuration, obviously. Yours will be different depending on your computer information. It looks like this, especially this line right there for app settings and the validation settings, unobtrusive validation mode. And lastly, if you go to default.aspx and switch back to source view, remember all of this generates a huge amount of markup that thankfully just operates behind the scenes and it works well. Otherwise, we have to code all of this by hand and it takes a very long time. So feel free if you need to pause and then obviously look through this carefully. I think we've seen a lot of this code at this point in one form or another. Okay, I'm going to leave it here. Thank you, and I'll see you in the last video where we finish this up.